A critical parliamentary report has labelled the government's legislation concerning Rwanda as incompatible with Britain's human rights obligations.
Yes, this, of course, as the bill is set to face more opposition when it returns to the House of Lords in the next half an hour or so. So, will this carry weight? Neil?
Well, I don't think myself that it's incompatible with Britain's human rights obligations, but I think the European Court of Human Rights would almost certainly find against the government if there were, and indeed there undoubtedly will be if the bill passes, cases that come before it. The Supreme Court decided that the government's policy was unlawful because they relied upon a report from the United Nations Refugee Convention, and there have been many criticisms of that. But there's no doubt these international organisations are quite happy to see Britain take an unlimited number of bogus asylum seekers from all around the world, because these conventions were actually created at a time when the world was completely different, and they were designed to cope with the chaos that was happening at the end of the Second World War. Weren't designed to deal with the kind of situation we've now got, where people are flooding in from the Middle East, from Africa and from elsewhere. So the bill itself is utterly futile, of course, because the European Court isn't bound by legislation passed by our Parliament.
You don't believe the Prime Minister when he says he'll simply say no to the rulings of the ECHR and the bill itself, which has notwithstanding clauses with regard to the Human Rights Act within it?
The idea that Rishi Sunak has the cojones to do that, I think, is absurd. And I think he's just kicking the can down the road, because even if the bill passes, there will be appeals directly to the European Court, and they will not be decided this side of a general election. So I think it's just a distraction from the real issue.
Judita, obviously there have been examples where the British Parliament has said no to the European Courts of Human Rights in the last 15 or so years. Prisoner voting is the biggest example of that. Is it credible for the Prime Minister to say, therefore, on this issue, he would do the same?
I think it's posturing, because I do agree that nothing's going to actually concretely happen this side of the election. But he has to present himself as someone that would be willing to take a hard line and go against an institution of power like that, which would make him look more prime ministerial, quote unquote. But in practicality, it's not going to hold water, because at the end of the day, when you look at the functionality of it, there are too many people against it who feel that they have been left out of the process on deciding the terms of this bill, and you cannot be seen to circumvent your own country's judiciary system to arrive at this conclusion. When they feel you're doing that, people initially have the reaction that you're hiding something, or it doesn't hold water. And that's why what the rhetoric has been from everyone who's criticised the bill. So if you actually are willing to put it up and say, OK, fine, pull it apart and let's rebuild it, there's more chance of down the road it's actually concretely happening.
Yes, because it's interesting. The likes of Robert Jenrick, who was in the Home Office, the likes of Suella Braverman, of course, who was the Home Secretary, have said, no, Rishi Sunak, this bill is not going to stop the merry-go-round of legal challenges. People will still be able to appeal Home Office decisions and appeal their deportation to Rwanda. It's not going to work. But Rishi Sunak insists, no, this is the toughest bill we've ever had.
I think part of me finds that ridiculous. But also, I think, again, everyone's kind of learned from, there's this knock-on effect of the Trump modus operandum, where there's a formula where no one can make me bend if I am the leader. And that's what everyone's trying to do. But what I feel also is that people have to be careful that when you pursue your advocacy for the refugees and do so with such zeal, you also run the risk of adopting a kind of rhetoric that's offensive to the Africans. Rwanda is a country with people who live in it. And so using terminology like it's inhumane, it harks back to a perception people have on Africa that's perpetuated by the West that doesn't really hold water.
That's an interesting point.
And that's something, as an African, it triggers me a lot when I think that. Where does this feeling that Rwanda is so inhumane comes from? It's because the perception you have has been fostered for generations by the way Britain talks about Africa.
Does it annoy you when, white liberals stand up and say, oh, Rwanda is this awful place, we can't send anyone there?
Yes, it does, because at the end of the day, it's a country with citizens in it that live there and have no desire to leave. They have problems like every country has problems. Some of their problems are more profound than others. But to speak of it in such a way that to say that a refugee going there is inhumane inhumane is offensive. And the dismissal of that kind of offensive terminology and verbiage just shows the kind of disregard you have for it as a country. And that's something that has to be taken into account, that your intentions may be noble to advocate for refugees, but the way you go about it needs to be more reticent of who you're offending in the process.
No, that's a really fascinating point. Neil, I want to zoom a bit outwards to look at the last time this bill was debated in the House of Lords. You had all the great and good of politics of ages past, but particularly Ken Clarke, of course, the former Chancellor, who stood up and said, actually, he wasn't just Chancellor, he was also Home Secretary at one point, but he stood up and said that this is outrageous, it's going against the courts. By declaring Rwanda as safe, you're going against the Supreme Court, and that's a breach of the separation of powers. But Neil, we don't have a separation of powers. We have parliamentary supremacy, don't we?
Well, we should have, but we don't. That's the reality, because people like Ken Clarke don't believe in the supremacy of Parliament. They think that it's far better for unelected judges in Strasbourg to decide ultimately what our laws on asylum and refugee status are. And the reality is that Parliament traditionally was the supreme lawmaker in this country, and if the courts ultimately, in the House of Lords, in its judicial capacity, formally decided one thing, and the government thought that it was wrong, it could change the law to reverse that. And that's happened many, many times in the course of our history. We have to decide, do we want elected politicians, ultimately, who are responsible to the voters, and we can kick out if we don't like them in a general election to decide what our laws are going to be, or judges we can't even name, from countries like Azerbaijan, who they have a judge of the European Court of Human Rights, would you believe, decide these things for us or not? Do we want to control our borders or not? I mean, going back to what you were saying earlier on about international law, if the European Court of Human Rights decided against the government, is Rishi Sunak really going to defy international law? I don't believe any British government should do that. The only way in which we could square this circle is to leave the European Convention on Human Rights,
but Neil,
and Parliament should then be supreme.
ECHR over prisoner voting?
No, we didn't. We did a deal with them over that, and what we did was say that certain prisoners wouldn't have a vote and certain prisoners would, and the European Court ultimately decided to accept that compromise. But the principle of supremacy of the European Court in its own jurisdiction has not been questioned by the British government. And I believe in international law, just as I believe in our domestic rule of law. But I don't believe in the rule of lawyers. And what we have to argue and decide here is whether we want our parliament ultimately to be supreme or unelected foreign judges.
And it's very different, isn't it? Prisoner voting and individual people, asylum seekers, appealing to the European Court.
Well, I don't know. I think the principle is similar. And I also think that the principle, for example, of overturning the convictions of postmasters is precisely the same. These were legal convictions that, if you have a separation of powers in America, Congress couldn't just do that, right? You'd have to go through a legal system under the Constitution. In the UK, we have parliamentary supremacy, so you can undo decisions of courts simply by an act of Parliament. And it looks like that the opposition of the House of Lords is almost predicated on the American system rather than the British one.
Yes, there's certainly a bit of confusion, perhaps a contradiction in all that. But thank you, Neil. Thank you, Judita.